Richard Saren's Strange Planet. Following the truth wherever it leads. Exposing evil and corruption and the secret machinations of powerful elites. Revealing the high strangeness beneath the surface of our supposed reality. Coming to you from the Great White North and his studio beneath the stairs. Here's Richard.
Welcome, friends. Good to have you aboard. We are about to delve into one of the things, I guess, is the hallmark of this program is to get beyond, I guess, the textbooks and those things that we were taught in school and look at life a little differently because we don't always get the truth from textbooks. Sometimes they're a little behind, that's true, and other times there are things about our past that is conveniently left out, and we're about to find out why that might be. You know, we've, I guess, always been sort of led to believe that civilization began about, I guess, 5,000 years ago or so, 4,400 years ago, ancient Greece, the cradle of civilization. Most of us now know that's not true, but how far back does advanced civilization go? Well, you are about to have your world rocked right now because we're about to speak with the author of The Lost Civilization Enigma. He's a regular contributor to magazines such as Atlantis Rising and Nexus magazine. He's labeled a skeptic by the believers and a believer by the skeptics, which is kind of a unique position that makes him a well-recognized voice of reason. He's the author of 8 books, including the best-selling The Ancient Alien Question, one of the leading contributors to the History Channel's popular series, Ancient Aliens. He lives in Edinburgh and L.A., I think, where we reached him tonight. A great honor to have Phillip Coppens back on The Conspiracy Show. Hello, Phillip. How are you?
Hello there, Richard. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. The Ancient Alien Question, which came out last year, and we talked to you at that time, and you talk about sort of the we are not alone. Now, in the Lost Civilization Enigma, what conclusions have you reached about lost civilizations?
That we weren't the first. And as you're saying in your introduction, you have very much this idea that we are 4, 5, 6,000 years still reigns. We have somehow shed away all of this idea that the world was created 6,000 years ago, but we still definitely cling to this notion that civilization is only 6,000 years old. And that's definitely the case if you're looking at textbooks. We go to Greece, Egypt, Sumer, and then there seems to be this big gap. And we are being told by science that we, the human species, have been around for 35,000 years ago. And it seems that for roughly 30,000 years of that existence, we did nothing whatsoever. And that is basically the image which science is telling us, that we didn't do anything, that there were slight pockets somewhere in the Middle East, roughly from 10,000 years onwards or so. A few cities like Göbekli Tepe, Cataluluk, Jericho, and a few more, but nothing too much. And that ever after, as if kind of like, there was a big fanfare, or God literally speaking out and saying, okay, now you can do civilization. And at 4,000, 3,000 BC, all of that began to happen everywhere. And that is really bizarre because the evidence suggests that we have been around for far longer, and that there are truly lost civilizations. Definitely, you can say that we have been very civilized pretty much from where we have been as a species 30,000 years ago. And you can see that, science will say this is sporadic and, discarded, like the cave paintings of Altamira or the cave paintings of Lascaux in France. Beautiful things which our ancestors did. And you would think that they are standalone, but just if you go over to the Dordogne region in France, you will see that these cave paintings are part of an extremely elaborate culture. Our ancestors 20,000, 25,000 years ago were doing everything. They were painting everywhere, and to some extent, the paintings are the only thing which remain because of the position where they were made. But these people were definitely, part of a civilization. Not to do with planes, not to do with Wi-Fi or anything of that kind, but a civilization which spanned larger than the country of France, which pretty much was across Europe, and with exchange of ideas, exchange of information, planning ideas, and what I find most interesting, an absolute conviction that we were more than just a physical human being, that we were more than just what we saw with our everyday senses. Our earliest ancestors, 30,000 years ago or so, figured out that there was more to life than just this stretch of time between birth and death, that there was something else, that there was a larger universe which somehow our brain could capture, and also that upon death it seemed that something happened there as well. And all of those things really are discarded by science. Science is truly not interested in this.
And why is that, Philip? I mean, not only are they not interested, it would appear that there is some evidence that they've been active in trying to obfuscate, perhaps discard knowingly evidence. What's at stake? Why are they afraid?
Well, they're afraid of many things. The book opens with a chapter called The New Inquisition, and it's a case of Glozelle. Now, Glozelle is a small village in France. At stake there was the possibility that writing was thousands of years older, or that somehow the dating of certain sites was basically inaccurate. In short, the reputation of some historians and various other academics was at stake. And you would think that scientists are very open-minded, and they would go like, okay, we were wrong, the new evidence is in, and we're just going to adapt our position to this. What happens in Glozelle is typical of what basically these scientists do, which is that their professor has published something, or they have published something, and if a new discovery is made, they will do everything to make sure that this new discovery is never going to contradict anything they or their predecessors has ever said. And as a result of that, you truly have got this iconoclastic ivory tower which is constantly kept in place. And in Glozelle, they do the most outrageous things. This is a farmer who has found these artifacts. The farmer was thrown in jail. He was thrown in jail so that the scientists involved, and these are the leading scientists in the field of anthropology and archaeology of the 1920s. He was thrown in jail so that these leading scientists could pretend that he had been arrested for fraud. And sure, he was arrested for fraud, but also the charges were dropped because there was no evidence whatsoever that he had falsified these archaeological findings. But ever since the 1920s, the leading archaeologists of so many universities will continue to say that this man, Émile Fradin, was arrested on charges of fraud, and to them that makes it all go away. It is such a narrow perspective. They twist the truth. They twist it to their advantage. One of the leading archaeologists of its time was a woman called Dorothy Garrow. She was teaching at Oxford. She went on to teach some of the leading archaeologists of our time. And Dorothy Garrow was found on the site of Glozelle trying to falsify the evidence herself. She was going to make sure that Glozelle was not going to happen.
But to what end? Okay, I understand. Yes, they're protecting reputations, or maybe they have tenure and they don't want to be discredited and so forth. But this new finding, okay, so it may prove that man had the capability of written language several thousand years earlier than previously thought. To me, I don't see that as a huge threat. But why send people to jail for something like that?
Because it is for them a huge threat. It is their reputations which are at stake. They have all published something at some point, whether it's the PhD thesis, which they have created. It's a framework which holds in very thin threads. Another example would be in Egypt, where they have constructed this entire timeline. The Great Pyramid dated to 2450-ish BC. There are carbon dates known to exist since the 1980s, which show that the Great Pyramid and its next door neighbor, the second pyramid, that one of Khafre, are 700 years older. These carbon dating results are uncontested. Everybody accepts that they are legit. However, the scientists involved refuse to publish them. And so they can pretend that because they haven't been published in a peer-reviewed journal, that they don't exist. They make up the rules of the game and then control the game. As a result of which, they can happily pretend, and have been pretending for the last 30 years, that everything is fine, that, there is such a thing. In the case of pyramids, again, not a single pyramid has ever been found which has an intact mummy. Scientists will say that this has all to do with the fact that all of these pyramids have been robbed. Well, that is not the case. In the 1950s, Egyptologists found an intact pyramid. Nobody had ever gone in there. When they came to the chamber, they found the seals intact. When they came to the coffin, the sarcophagus, they found the seals intact there. When they removed the lid of the sarcophagus, they found it empty. There was nothing in there. The same case for the Great Pyramid.
Philip, let me jump in here. We'll take a time out. When we come back, we'll continue to delve into ancient civilizations, and we'll also talk about some other pyramids in Bosnia, for example, and why the scientific community has been lining up against their discoverers. And we'll talk about Atlantis and many other things with Phillip Coppens, the author of The Lost Civilization Enigma. Back with more of The Conspiracy Show. Stay with us.
The truth will set you free. But first, it will really tick you off. Welcome back to Richard Syrett's Strange Planet.
And we're talking about before recorded history, new discoveries about the people of lost civilizations. Phillip Coppens is with us. The author is an author and investigative journalist ranging from the world of politics to ancient history and mystery. He co-hosts the Spirit Revolution radio show with his wife, Kathleen McGowan, as a frequent contributor to Nexus Magazine and Atlantis Rising. And his new book is entitled The Lost Civilization Enigma. We were talking about Egypt, Philip, and I wanted to ask you, I was reading recently about these winged wooden objects that were found in an Egyptian tomb back in at the turn of the 19th century. I think it was the tomb was called Saqqara. And these they resembled model airplanes, these wooden objects. They had wings, they had a tail section, they even had what appeared to be a fuselage. And I'm wondering what you make of that. I mean, is it possible that the ancient Egyptians had some form of had mastered flight in some rudimentary fashion, or what do you make of those discoveries?
Well, definitely they knew the principles of flight, and those objects, pretty much were thrown in the air, and basically were, there to play with, so to speak. But obviously, there's a big difference between knowing about flight and how to do these things, but then you also need some aspect of speed. Planes go into the air at various speeds depending on their weight. It's as simple as that, and that is something for which we really have no evidence whatsoever that the ancient Egyptians were able to do that. Nor do I think were they too interested in that. They were very spiritual people. They were mostly interested in working on aspects to do with building projects, to do with what we would call spiritual technology, i.e. how to get our mind out of our body, and how to do this on what I would call regulated basis. It's basically building structures and pretty much creating environments whereby we somehow know that, this is beauty, this is designed with certain specific fractions in mind. And that's something which you see all over Egypt. They had such thing as phi and pi, and they were working with this because they realized that they could build incorporating the beauty to which nature was adhering to as well. And we all know that when mankind builds, we can build atrocities or we can build beautiful buildings. And definitely the ancient Egyptians knew how to create beautiful buildings, which to this very day inspire us. So their interest lay very much more in building and applying all of these things than simply trying to build a plane or whatever. It was something for which they really didn't have the technology, but most specifically not the interest.
Well, Can you give me an example, though, of a piece of technology that an ancient civilization had that left you absolutely gobsmacked, if I can use that expression?
Lenses. Our ancestors were looking at the stars, they were looking at the moon by using crystal lenses. They are in various locations, for example, in the British Museum, but they are not recognized for what they are. And there's actually evidence by the likes of Kramer, who was translating some of the ancient Greek texts for the likes of Strabo. And when he was confronted with this, he basically writes quite clearly, saying, well, I know this says glass lenses, but we know our ancestors, the Greeks, couldn't possibly have had these. By the way, at a moment in time when these lenses were lying around in museums. And so he decided to change it. He decided to, on purpose, mistranslate some of these ancient texts to do with Strabo, instead saying that our ancestors were using tubes, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But our ancestors were using lenses. They used primitive forms of telescopes, i.e. two lenses, working together. And they made observations about the moon. They made observations about various other things in the sky. And in various museums, including the British Museum one, some of these lenses remain largely, not necessarily unrecognized, but definitely underappreciated by science. And so to find that our ancestors were very much the stargazers, and that they pretty much used glass technology. Glass is not that easy to make, and they were perfecting this so that they could look at the stars. That was definitely something which, I found extremely interesting.
I was in Athens a year ago, visited the National Archeological Museum, where, of course, how would you describe it? It's an ancient analog computer, really. It's the Antikythera mechanism. First of all, for those who haven't seen this, describe what it is and how it was discovered and what you think it's for.
Well, it was discovered at the very beginning of the 20th century in a shipwreck off the coast of Antikythera, hence its name. It's a metal device. It pretty much was half destroyed, if not more destroyed, by being on the bottom of the sea for roughly 2 millennia, as a result of which it's very hard to reconstruct, and it took people, first of all, several decades before they began to do so, but then largely to the work of somebody called Derek Solar Price in the 1960s, people really began to take note of this, and specifically in the last few decades, quite a number of people are actually doing research on this. What they are identifying is that the Antikythera device is something of a scale model of our solar system, thrown in certain things such as the zodiac, the moon, some stars, and that pretty much it was meant to be put into effect, that if you sort of switch the button, then all of these scale replicas of the planets began to work and pretty much behave as our solar system did.
So calculate astronomical positions. But we're talking 1st century BC here. I mean, from what I understand, and I had this conversation at the museum in Athens, someone was saying this kind of technology, this kind of workmanship, we didn't have until probably the 14th century.
And I think this is a misconception. I think we do have it. There is evidence that we have it. There is just disbelief. In the book, I point out something else, which is that our ancestors were saying that somebody in a remote past mapped the entire world. That there was the science of geodesy, which basically our ancestors were absolutely familiar with. You see this. You see that our ancestors, the Celts, were able to identify, for example, the center of England. For that, they needed to have mapped England, which is, several hundreds of miles long. They were able to do this and pinpoint this with greater accuracy than people in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century were doing. And it is because they had access to information which our ancestors had acquired at some point in the past. It is just the case that we are not crediting our ancestors with that information, and we pretend that, there is this linear tradition of basically stupid ancestor to somewhat clever ancestor, and then all of a sudden in recent centuries everything has been discovered or invented. And that is simply not the case. We are quite often reinventing things which our ancestors had invented a long time ago. And I think the Antikythera device is one of these reinventions, or basically, one of the earlier inventions, and that we are reinventing pretty much the wheel.
Phillip Coppens, the author of The Lost Civilization Enigma. We were talking about the pyramids earlier, Phillip, and I want to talk about pyramids that have been discovered elsewhere. In 2005, huge controversy when these formations were identified as pyramids in Bosnia, and of course, again, the Orthodox scientific community lined up and said these are natural formations, not man-made pyramids. What are your thoughts?
Well, I've been involved with the saga of the Bosnian pyramids from pretty much the word go 2006. I was a participant on the first international conference on the Bosnian pyramids in 2008, and that had some of the leading lights of Egyptology there. I mean, the current Minister of Antiquities, Mohammed Ibrahim Ali, was there. The leading archaeologists from China were there. And there is very much an east-west divide when it comes to the Bosnian pyramids. And the reason for that is that the Western world archaeologists, specifically the European ones, somehow felt left out. They somehow felt that they were far more important than the people who were involved. And so they began an active campaign, pretty much of disinformation. The likes of Anthony Harding, who was at that moment in time the president of the European Association of Archaeologists, basically told all of his archaeologists that if any of them were ever found to be working at the Bosnian pyramid site, that he would personally make sure that they would never, ever, 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 ever work on any archaeological dig anywhere else. That is threatening behavior. That is not science. And it has to do with the fact that, again, they realized that in the case of the Bosnian pyramids very early on, they weren't going to control the information. This information, which is scientific, things like carbon dating results, were going to come out without their sort of stamp of approval or their way to manipulate the information. They realized that the framework which they had constructed of European history might fall apart for a number of reasons. And so they went on a vociferous attack, with pretty much ad hominem attacks against the likes of Sam Osmanagic. And when you go on things like Wikipedia, you can still see how the opening sentence there says, oh, this is all natural and nothing whatsoever to do with man-made. Well, click on the talk page and you will see the good works of Doug Weller at work there. And Doug Weller is basically somebody who prides himself on exposing that archaeologist, but basically is the worst case example of that. He basically was once asked, well, the ICBP in 2008 said that these structures were more than likely man-made and that further research was required. That is 4 years ago. Since then, the landscape has completely changed. In 2008, we had the likes of Dr. Ali Barakat, who was a PhD geologist who had been sent to Bosnia on the recommendation of Dr. Zahi Hawass. And he basically absolutely came out stating that these were man-made structures. He spent 42 days doing the analyses at that moment in time.
Suppose they are man-made. I mean, and one of them that has been dubbed the Pyramid of the Sun in Bosnia, if it is in fact man-made, it would make it the largest pyramid in the world. If they are man-made, they are real pyramids. What is the significance of that?
It basically is the significance because what we have here is a civilization which, the way where they placed is something called Old Europe. This was a civilization which was dated between 6,500 and 3,000 BC. Specifically, the likes of one doctor called Maria Gimbutas has written about this extensively. So we know that some of the oldest civilizations in the world are present within that catchment area. So far, there was no evidence of pyramids, but right now, clearly, that has changed. And it is no longer a question of if they're man-made. They are man-made. It is as simple as that. They are amongst the largest pyramids in the world. The the steps which are beginning to be uncovered is something which we're seeing throughout the world. And I'm going to go briefly to Stonehenge to actually explain this, because in Stonehenge what you have is the scientific dogma which tries to say Stonehenge is 3000 BC, even though there are numerous indications, if not evidence, that Stonehenge actually goes back to 8000 BC. But continuously they have tried to explain that evidence away. The likes of Robert Langdon, who's a local archaeologist there, is basically trying to get Stonehenge redated and saying, like, what are you guys doing? Why do you try to keep this at 3000 BC when it's so abundantly clear, supported by evidence, supported by carbon dating, that it's 8000 BC? And the same thing seems to be happening in Bosnia. Now, in Bosnia, it seems to be something of a completely different bailiwick, because this year, for the first time, there was carbon dating results done on the Pyramid of the Sun in June, and the University of Kiev came back with a carbon dating result of 24,800 years old, which would make it extremely older. Now, it is only just one carbon dating result. More carbon dating results need to happen. More information needs to come out. But when archaeologist Dr. Ricardo Brett basically was presenting this at a conference in September on the latest discoveries on the Bosnian pyramids, he basically said 25,000 years ago, again, we think that this is so outside of the bailiwick of our ancestors and civilization, but it sits right in between what we know for such cultures as Lascaux. The ancient Egyptian civilization, the ancient Egyptians themselves said that they went back 25,000 years ago.
Philip, you mentioned our ancestors. I mean, who are our ancestors that are building these pyramids this long ago in Bosnia, in the New World? Who were our ancestors? Are you any closer to understanding who they were, what they were all about?
They were the likes of you and I. They had the same brain power. They had the same physique. They had the same, preoccupations. They were like us, and they built it because somehow somebody somewhere, the answers might be, in my first book, The Ancient Alien Question, might have given them this information. Basically, all cultures say that in a distant past, our ancestors were given information and that they began to work with this information.
Okay, Philip, we've got to take a time out. We'll pick it up on the other side. Don't go away. Lost Civilization Enigma, Phillip Coppens here on The Conspiracy Show. Stay with us.
This is Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. Follow Richard on Twitter @Richard Syrett. For show information, visit the website strangeplanet.ca.
Welcome back. Phillip Coppens is with us, the Lost Civilization Enigma. Let me ask you about the Baghdad Battery, sometimes referred to as the Parthian Battery. Philip, first of all, describe what these things look like and what they may have been used for and when they were made.
Well, obviously the Baghdad Battery goes to Iraq. It goes to a time when basically there is believed to have been no such thing as the possibility of working with battery, but it is believed, based on basically the batteries which have been found, that our ancestors were able to play with chemicals to create some form of current which would be allowed to basically plate some metals. It's still very controversial. It's definitely not something which has got an easy answer. For example, which chemicals would have been involved, what kind of current, whether and all of these things are, as straightforward as some people have proposed. But definitely, again, you're seeing that our ancestors were experimenting with technology way earlier than we normally give them credit for, and this is something which you see throughout the world. And the Baghdad Battery, an awful lot of these things, when you move into such things like metal Baghdad batteries or metal Antikythera devices, we all know, even today, how much of our technology rusts or is subject to problems. And so to be confronted with metal objects which are hundreds, if not thousands of years old is a bit of a challenge. Time does not look kindly towards metals. And so us trying to reconstruct or figure out what these devices once were is extremely hard.
And what is your take? I mean, was this device actually producing some type of voltage, do you think?
I think indeed it was more than likely producing some kind of low voltage through which they could, basically work with certain metals and plate and work with them in basically creating them in the shape, form, and whatever aspect they wanted it to be. There's clear evidence that our ancestors were very much familiar with things like, just on a slightly different scale, like medicine. Our ancestors, knew so much about herbal medicine. They knew so much, and we today have lost that. We have big pharma doing things in certain ways, and we think somehow that our ancestors would know that or do that as well. We consider that to be some form of high technology, being able to create a pill out of chemical substances. Our ancestors basically were familiar with the fact that everything which we needed somehow was there inside nature, and they had basically an encyclopedic knowledge of what was there in nature, and they applied it, and they took it, and they prepared it for human consumption and for human illnesses. It's a different approach. Our ancestors were far more knowledgeable and were far more able to play with things. Things like when people say how certain statues might have been subjected to some form of levitation, or how to work with getting stones somehow soft. Well, there are birds in South America who go to a certain tree and take the juices from that tree, and they know that even in the hardest rock, by using that liquid, they can basically soften this stone up, and they can create nests. All it takes is our ancestors to look at the bird and say, oh, wow, that's interesting. Let's see whether we can do that ourselves. Let's see whether we can work with these juices and do the same thing. So much is about observation and analysis, and that is something which we seem to have forgotten. We seem to try to do everything through technology. Our ancestors relied on some technology, but largely they relied on knowledge.
Well, let me see if we can push the boundaries here a little bit. A primitive battery is one thing. But let's go back to July 1945 when Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist behind the Manhattan Project, of course, and the first detonation of a nuclear device at Alamogordo. And then sometime after that, he's delivering this seminar about that blast that he nicknamed Trinity. And a college student asks if that had been the first detonation of a nuclear device on planet Earth, and Oppenheimer's answer, of course, well, yes, in modern times. What do you think he meant by that?
I think he meant exactly what he said. I think he meant that in the past there had been not necessarily identical devices, but definitely similar devices of great destruction. And you see the likes of Tesla, who were pretty much in his time as well. Tesla understood certain things about the nature of this planet. And at one point he basically said that he understood how to split the Earth into two. Now that's, I'm one of those people who thinks that it's quite a good thing that the FBI invaded Tesla's home and his research laboratories and made sure this kind of information didn't get out there, because it's quite a dangerous thing. I quite like the Earth to be one rather than two pieces. But it again goes into this notion of knowledge. And so what we're seeing is that our ancestors are having knowledge as well. But that in the case, I think, of when it comes to all of these atomic experiments, what they were specifically referring to was texts such as the Mahabharata and other Indian epics, whereby basically our ancestors were describing wars fought in the sky, and they were describing battles between the gods and battles which, even though they were fought within the gods, somehow had a result on planet Earth. People. Let
me jump in here. We've got to take another time out. We'll come back and talk Atlantis. Phillip Coppens, The Lost Civilization Enigma.
The truth goes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as self-evident. You're listening to Richard Syrett's Strange Planet.
Phillip Coppens is with us. The Lost Civilization Enigma, a new inquiry into the existence of ancient cities, cultures, and peoples who predate recorded history. Philip, a lot of speculation about Atlantis. What and where is Atlantis, and what's the best evidence for its existence?
Well, the best evidence for its existence is basically what Plato told us. Plato was the guy who wrote it down, who said he wrote it down in a book of history. He said it was history, and we currently live in a mindset whereby somehow we defer to scientists who basically say that he didn't mean it to be history, that somehow him saying it was history was some kind of literary device, and that he was basically describing an idealized state. And that is a position which you simply cannot maintain if you are truly scientific, because in his time, the 4th century BC, Plato had his own attackers. They didn't believe this. So what they did was they jumped on a boat, they sailed to Egypt, they spoke to the priests who had related this story to Solon a few years before. The priest said, yes, we know about this lost civilization called Atlantis. It is written on that column over there. The likes of Crantor jumped back into their boats, sailed back to Greece, and basically said, yes, we were skeptical, but indeed the ancient Egyptians did have the story of Atlantis, and therefore what we hear Solon say and Plato wrote down is absolutely accurate, in the sense that the ancient Egyptians believed that Atlantis existed. Obviously, their belief doesn't necessarily mean that Egypt existed, that Atlantis existed. But the story of Atlantis is about a lost civilization which is 10,000 years old. We now know that 10,000 years ago we were at the end of the last ice age. It meant that areas of Europe and the Atlantic Ocean were exposed, which are now below the sea. We know that there were gigantic ice sheets which were beginning to melt. Things like Scotland and parts of England were under an ice sheet which was 2 miles high. All of that began to melt, as a result of which the water levels began to rise. What we hear in the story of Atlantis is indeed that the waters began to rise and that the civilization of Atlantis was destroyed in a single day and a single night, because it was actually a plain level civilization. So once it began to flood somewhere, everything flooded. This civilization of Atlantis, if you listen to dates which are put down by Plato, that existed from roughly 25,000 BC to 10,000 years ago. When you look to certain scientists like Dr. Mary Settergast, she wrote a wonderful book called Plato Prehistorian, and she identifies what we know about civilization in 20,000 to 10,000 BC in the areas which Plato said were under the influence of Atlantis. And then we look at what Plato said, and the two overlap. So the only thing missing is the possibility that there was indeed an island somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. And in the book Lost Civilization Enigma, I actually put forward a possible location for this. It is the work of a Dutch scientist called Willem Zitman, who has been looking into such things as Stonehenge, Giza Plateau, Teotihuacan, and Tiwanaku, and felt that their positioning on the map of the world was no coincidence. He basically found that together with a site in the Atlantic Ocean, they form the layout of the constellation of Orion. And we all know that Orion was a very important constellation, both in such places as Teotihuacan in Mexico, but also in such places as Giza. The importance of this constellation for for Stonehenge and Tiwanaku isn't clear yet, simply because too little evidence and too little research has happened in these two sites to come up with a possible correlation with Orion. But it is, one of these things, once again, that it is clear that the New World and the Old World were somehow in communication. Imagine there are millions of stars out there. we know that on the Old World and the New World, these were grouped pretty much identical. Both Orion was identified and grouped as such in the New World and the Old World. Orion's belt was then specifically linked with pyramid building. Teotihuacan complex was built in the layout of Orion's belt, as were the three pyramids on the Giza Plateau.
Just so I'm clear here, is the suggestion that some civilization hailing from somewhere in the Orion belt was working with whomever here on Earth, helping to build pyramids, helping to build Stonehenge, involved in the technology, perhaps giving the technology to the Atlanteans?
It's a possibility, but I wouldn't go as far as that at this moment in time. In both the mythology of the ancient Egyptians and the Mayans, what they say is that there is somehow a cradle of life just south of Orion's belt, which somehow has an effect on life, whether this is some kind of, emission of energy or whatever it is at this moment in time, we don't know. And for all we know, and we should be open to this, our ancestors were simply confused or mistaken. But it is a fact that both the ancient Egyptians and the Mayans were absolutely adamant about this fact. They linked this area with magical birth. And so they incorporate it into the layouts of these important complexes, and they link it with the gods. They say that the gods convened, that the gods descended from the sky in these places, i.e. Teotihuacan and the Giza Plateau. And I think, once again, we need to go back to older times of like 30,000 BC, the beginning of mankind, when we have a consistent picture. Our ancestors, whether they are ancient Egyptians or whether they are a different civilization, they say that the gods were present on Earth, that they helped us in this endeavor called civilization. And we see civilization beginning at that moment in time. It's not as if, there were thousands of years before the ancient Egyptian civilization began. You can clearly see that our ancestors were far more civilized much longer before. And I find it interesting that, we are beginning to find, as in the case of the Bosnian pyramids, for example, this 25,000 years old thing. That is precisely the date which the ancient Egyptians say the ancient gods came to planet Earth.
How technologically advanced were the Atlanteans? Give me some examples of the kinds of technology you suspect they had.
I think technology-wise, they were not that much. I think what they had was an extremely important and an extremely advanced form of understanding. I think most of their technology had to do with understanding as to how to work with water. Today, various cultures, specifically in Russia, there are, scientists in Russia right now who are studying how pyramid power, basically putting a pyramid on the landscape, how it affects the water underneath the pyramid, underground streams which are there, how it affects the water nearby. Somehow it creates a kind of energy, a kind of vibration in this water, simply through the shape of what it is. Our ancestors seem to have been aware of this, and they seem to have been able to play with this. They also realized the importance of basically surrounding certain parts with water, not defensively, but basically how this was energetic, how putting giant stones on the landscape somehow created this effect as well, how you somehow were able to literally pull information into, rocks. We do this today. Computers and so much else of our technology is basically putting information into quartz or sand. That is pretty much how a watch works, and that's pretty much how a computer works. But again, we do all of this very much with technology, hard technology, big machinery. And I think our ancestors were aware of something called, you might call it spiritual technology. Actually, the likes of Paul Davis, who is a professor of astrobiology at the University of Arizona in Phoenix, he actually has come up with something saying non-material technology, in which he's basically saying that pretty much technology of an advanced civilization, when we connect to it, is pretty much on par with magic. It's very hard to visualize this, but in a nutshell, what you might see is some kind of light phenomena, hanging somewhere, and then all of a sudden something happens. It's very much working with the fabric of the universe rather than building a big machine or a sledgehammer and putting it into work like that. And that is, again, conform with what our ancestors are saying about some of these things, like how some objects were sometimes floated into space, levitation, all of these things. It is looking at the way the universe works and beginning to realize and how to play with this. Tesla is a 20th century example of this. But definitely, right now we have certain scientists who are beginning to realize that technology doesn't have to come in space rockets or big machinery, but that technology also involves levels of, first of all, understanding the fabric of the universe and then being able to work with that. And again, they go as far as basically say that an advanced civilization might actually have non-material technology, i.e. you don't need a machine. It is somehow non-material. It really works with the energies of the universe as such, and that is a technology.
Do you suspect that, what is placed on the shelves on exhibit in museums is mere window dressing in order to sort of buttress this orthodox timeline that has been laid out for us, and that what they have stored in crates in the basement, that's the real story, and that they're not going to let us see that?
Yes and no. I think that there are objects in museums which are purposefully ridiculed or misrepresented, either in dates or in importance. The lenses is one example of that. The Leyland lens, this telescopic lens used by the Babylonians, sits inside the British Museum. Everybody can see it. There are crystal skulls inside the British Museum, and they're labeled as being 19th century fakes. Well, first of all, that's not the case. But if they were, just remove them from the display. Why put them there? But there are definitely things, not necessarily in the vaults of museums. I think actually most of the material remains in situ. Things like the sarcophagi in the Serapeum in Saqqara in Egypt, Well, they have come up with ridiculous theories as to how this is somehow coffins for bulls who were deified. Clearly, something else was happening there. We might not know necessarily what, but we definitely know that the traditional explanations do not fit. And so I think it's a combination of objects. Sometimes they're on display, but they're misquoted. Sometimes they're not on display, and sometimes they remain in situ. Overall, however, museums do play the role of window dressing. They do pretend that, everything in them and which is on display is extremely important and shows this adventure of civilization. And in truth, it is a misrepresentation. And specifically when it comes to things like the British Museum, there are far more interesting artifacts in far smaller museums elsewhere in the world who are far more important than some of the objects which are inside the British Museum or things like the Smithsonian.
Well, Philip, I really appreciate your time, and congratulations on completing the Lost Civilization Enigma. I guess this will slowly change, but only as the old guard, these gatekeepers sort of die off and replaced by younger, more, innovative, courageous minds, people such as yourself. Philip, congratulations again, and thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you for having me on your show, Richard.
All right. The Lost Civilization Enigma. Back next week, we'll talk with rock and roll investigator R. Gary Patterson as we near the anniversary that gave rise to the whole Paul McCartney is dead legend. R. Gary Patterson will explain that. Is the Paul McCartney, the Sir Paul McCartney we see today, in fact, the same one that started all those years ago with the Beatles? Or is he a replica, a clone? We'll find out. In the meantime, don't be afraid. There's nothing concealed that won't be revealed, and nothing hidden that won't be made known. What you hear in the dark, speak in the light. What I say in a whisper, proclaim from the housetops. Thank you, Tim. Move over, Aphrodite. I'm coming home. Good night.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Subscribe at strangeplanetpodcast.com.